Dark Matter, Lessons from Bradford's Counterculture. The world right now, as you may have noticed, is pretty messed up. The triple crunch of economic, environmental and social crisis is being felt all over, evidenced by a rise in economic inequality, natural disaster, far-right xenophobia and racism, and mass social and political unrest. Gramsci wrote in his prison notebooks in 1930 that crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Are we experiencing the death throes of late capitalism, waiting for the new to be born? If so, what comes next, and where from? In the early 2000s, feminist economic geographers J.K. Gibson Graham wrote of post-capitalism as a necessary next stage in human evolution, a term since popularised by journalist Paul Mason. They propose that in order to save ourselves and the world from the destructive expansionism of capitalism, an alternative economic model is required. There is no roadmap or blueprint to this brighter future. We can't see the details of what it will look like. What Gibson Graham, along with sociologist John Holloway, do see, however, are glimpses of non- or post-capitalist realities in the here and now. The economic order is not just a structure, it is a way of thinking and acting that is sustained by our conscious or unconscious consent. We make capitalism through our acquiescence with the idea that its principles are natural and that there is no alternative. As Marxist geographer David Harvey wrote on the rise of neoliberal ideology in the 1970s and 80s, all forms of social solidarity were to be dissolved in favour of individualism, private property, personal responsibility and family values. The ideological assault along those lines that flowed from Thatcher's rhetoric was relentless and broadly successful. Economics are the method, she said, but the object is to change the soul. In his book Crack Capitalism, John Holloway attempts to identify and name human activity that resists this colonisation of the soul. He sees labour that creates capital, or work, as a process of self-entrapment, and that the creation of an alternative to capitalism will emerge from our partaking in another form of activity that he refers to variously as concrete doing, just doing, or, following Marx more closely, conscious life activity. What instances of this non-capitalist activity exist, and where do they occur? Holloway gives examples ranging from baking cakes for friends to the Zapatista uprisings, but we can also reveal instances of cultural and artistic just doing by digging deeper into the underground activity of minor cities and their grassroots scenes. Bradford is a city in the north of England. It was a major city in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century and one-time wool capital of the world. Bradford has its problems, many of which are overplayed in the mainstream press, who focus on racial tensions, economic deprivation and serial killers, often painting Bradford as the down-on-its-luck poor cousin to its more economically successful neighbour, Leeds. The neoliberal dream of post-industrial regeneration has been shown to be an empty promise here, time and time again. Beneath the surface of a minor city with not much going on, however, is a plethora of underground, fleeting, difficult to define, heterogeneous, unknowable and sometimes intangible activity emerging from the gaps and cracks revealed by the uneven development of capitalism. Polish hip-hop nights, koala music gatherings, the UK's longest-running folk club, arts collectives and queer nights in the 1 in 12 Club Anarchist Social Centre, numerous community-focused theatre groups, voluntary-run refugee and asylum seeker organisations, spontaneous vigils in support of migrants, Bradford Community Broadcasting 106.6 FM, empty shops and market stalls used for socially engaged arts and avant-garde performance, scratch orchestras and commoners' choirs, disabled arts charities, spoken word in beer shops, under-the-counter Korean food available only on Thursdays, free curry in Indian bars on Wednesdays, club nights and raves in former mills, sound systems in pub gardens. The list goes on. Bradford has a long legacy in fostering grassroots cultural forms that blur art and the social. The lack of infrastructure and resources has meant that a collective and open do-it-yourself approach has been pragmatic, whilst cheap and plentiful space in which to experiment abounds. The waves of migration prompted by industry's need for trade and cheap labour have seen Bradford first in welcoming new communities, offering endless opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and collaboration. Looking back at the last 50 years, we find the birth of street theatre and public happenings in the late 60s, the formation of claimants' unions and dole queue discos, mass sit-downs and creative protests against the National Front, LGBT, Asian youth and women's movements, peace activism and poetry, warehouse parties leading to huge-scale people-led festivals and mellors, the boom of the UK hardcore punk and the Asian underground music scenes. Much of this activity did, and still does, operate beneath the radar of a mainstream that prefers to focus on grander, less complex and more commercially impactful forms. It is fleeting, often presented without fanfare to an audience of participants rather than spectators, and generally undocumented, with only memories and a few cardboard boxes and rolls of posters in an attic or garage from those that took part, paying testament to multiple magical and transformative moments. American artist, activist and writer Gregory Shalet has termed this informal art activity as creative or cultural dark matter. He writes, "Like its astronomical cousin, creative dark matter also makes up the bulk of the artistic activity produced in our post-industrial society. However, this type of dark matter is invisible primarily to those who lay claim to the management and interpretation of culture. The critics, art historians, collectors, dealers, museums, curators and arts administrators. It includes makeshift, amateur, informal, unofficial, autonomous, activist, non-institutional, self-organised practices. All work made and circulated in the shadows of the formal art world, some of which might be said to emulate cultural dark matter by rejecting art world demands of visibility, and much of which has no choice but to be invisible. This activity might be hard to detect, but that does not mean it is insignificant. In this creative dark matter that thrives so well in the shadows are the roots of new social and economic forms. The international do-it-yourself scene is often talked about as a testbed that demonstrates another world is possible, where power relationships different to those found under capital are created. Whilst we should be wary of romanticising them, there are lessons to be learned from the way in which self-organised and countercultural communities are formed and sustained, operating as they do on principles of shared authorship, open participation, horizontal and flexible structures that democratise power. Many of these elements have been co-opted and adapted by late capitalism, but can closer analysis reveal the building blocks for a new, more just and sustainable economy? What makes Bradford and minor cities like it so vital and fascinating is the future they propose. Bradford is a place failed hardest by capitalism, and as such is a city where alternative economic and organisational models are laid bare. The collective ways of working and acting together, the support networks and mutual aids that have been forged to address a lack, are free to grow wild, constantly changing shape and finding new forms. It is a city of the self-organised future, a lab for post-capitalism. Taking this perspective, places like Bradford are no longer seen as lagging behind their major cousins, but rather at the bleeding edge of global development. Whilst neoliberal cultural regeneration strategies standardise our cities in increasingly desperate attempts to identify and celebrate positive success stories in the capitalist narrative, the dark matter holding it together proposes a new chapter, perhaps even a new book entirely. To conclude, I'd like to address two issues. Firstly, dark matter's relationship to the state and market infrastructure, and secondly, the new forms it is taking in response. It would be naive to think we can separate alternative activity from the structure that surrounds it. Much of the dark matter that emerges from self-organised and independent production has some dependence on the institution, market or state, a hidden helping hand in the form of the dole, benefits, enterprise schemes, arts councils, wealthy benefactors, rate relief, or peppercorn rents charged by local authorities, not to mention public health care, protected workers' rights, and systemic privilege. The security afforded by the welfare state has been a vital part of the ecology for self-organisation. Today, in Bradford and other minor cities like it, the resources that allow the time, energy and basic means to build the new within the shell of the old are being dismantled and decimated by central government and local council cuts. The struggle for a brighter future, then, is clearly not just about proliferating DIY cultural activity, but a fight for preserving, expanding and democratising the conditions that foster it. These conditions are not just material and structural, but also psychological, emotional and social, and here we can see the new shoots of dark matter stirring, adapting and evolving. In 2014, the Institute for Precarious Consciousness released their text, 6 Theses on Anxiety and the Prevention of Militancy, which outline the challenges the left face today and offered an analysis of its inertia. They see the tactics of the left, even the new left, as addressing a solution to a past problem. Boredom was the control strategy of a previous phase of capitalism, and it has managed to absorb and co-opt the struggles against it. They write that in contemporary capitalism, the dominant reactive effect is anxiety. All forms of intensity, self-expression, emotional connection, immediacy and enjoyment are now laced with anxiety. It has become the linchpin of subordination. What we now need is a machine for fighting anxiety, and this is something we do not yet have. Today's main forms of resistance still arise from the struggle against boredom, and since boredom's replacement by anxiety have ceased to be effective. One lens through which we can view dark matter today, then, is as a site for the emergence of new tactics to counter anxiety. In Bradford, we can see a shift in the role places like the 1 in 12 club perform. Once a wild anarcho-punk club where anything goes, the emphasis for younger members is now on creating a respectful, mutually supportive safe space. Likewise, the issues that young people are organising around in the city tend to be about emotional support, safety and well-being rather than entertainment or partying. Perhaps what we're seeing is a return to a more pragmatic and applied version of culture, one that seeks to create the conditions from which a better world can emerge by and for all. And it's this that we can learn from the creative dark matter of our minor cities.